with this in mind, I will turn it over to Tim and Lenton to kick us off. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Millie. We're delighted to be here, everybody. I'll start, and we're going to be talking about tipping points and cascades in the Earth system and economic systems. A simple message would be, if we're going to avoid bad tipping points in the climate system, we're going to need to find some positive tipping points in our social, economic, etc. systems. We want to try and show how a common understanding of complex systems can help identify those positive tipping points, as well as identifying the threatening tipping points. So I guess part of the message is, don't be paralyzed by complexity. I know it's easy to feel paralyzed by complexity, but this presentation is all about how we have some tools to understand complex systems and to inform our decisions to try and create a better future. So I'll talk about grounds for concern, the evidence we have that there are tipping points in the Earth systems, but that'll also hopefully convey some of the basic principles that we can apply also in the social realm. So I'm going to start with this little movie. It's like a little toy model of a system that's going to pass a tipping point in a minute. But it's an example of a system. It could be anything. It could be an ice sheet, or it could be part of the energy economy. But it's a system that initially had what we would call two different stable states. It can only be in one of them. And the one that it started in was losing its stability until you saw it pass a tipping point into the other state, from one valley to the other. Just run it once more. And this toy model is quite a good description of lots of different elements of the climate system, for example, that have alternative stable states that can be tipped between them. But we'll also show that we think this is a reasonable model for how we can think about transforming social and economic systems to a low carbon future. One other thing to know is that before that tipping point happened in the video, there are characteristic early warning signals. A system becomes more sluggish in its response to all the fluctuations and perturbations it's getting from the world before it tips. And we see that across a whole range of complex systems. And in fact, what I'm summarizing here is the kind of broad literature that exists on tipping points in complex systems, spanning what I would call climate or earth systems in yellow and gold, ecological systems in the water in blue, on the land in green, or at the interface in grey, and also tipping points in the social systems in red, across a whole range of different space and time scales. All of these are kind of cartooned with a similar model to the one I've just shown you. I'm going to focus in on the climate system because it's a big source of risk right now that we need to do something about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit first about how even before humans started profoundly altering the climate in the last couple of centuries, we did that against the backdrop of an Earth climate that is unusually unstable, I would say. So this is a plot of the last 80,000 years as recorded in an ice core drilled on the Greenland ice cap. And it's a measure, or we say a proxy of temperature on the y-axis. And it's there just to highlight that during the last ice age that ended around 10,000 years ago, there are at least 20 abrupt climate change events, warming of the order of 10 degrees Celsius within a decade, happened repeatedly. We usually comfort ourselves that the last 10,000 years or so that geologists call the Holocene epoch, in which all agriculture, city-states, what we call civilization has developed, that looks superficially more stable than the Ice Age was, but it too contains some tipping points in the climate where there are major shifts in monsoon systems in the tropics that are, for example, linked to the rise and fall of past civilizations. And it's against that backdrop that we're hitting the climate hard. So it's been about 15 years now since I first tried to identify, well, if we're hitting the climate hard, which bits of the climate system might we tip into an alternative state due to our activities? And that's what this map tried to summarize. It included something that had already happened and we were busy trying to repair, and that's the Antarctic ozone hole. But everything else on the map were candidates for what I called elements or tipping elements of the climate that could have alternative states, could be tipped from one to another due to our activities, global warming in essence. And we get information as to what to put on the map from three basic sources. We have the record of Earth's climate past, which can sometimes show past tipping points happening. We have our complicated, sophisticated climate models, which we do these projections with of the future, where we sometimes see abrupt shifts happening in the models. And then we just have our core understanding as scientists of the processes involved that sometimes give us a strong reason to think that there could be a tipping point. And in this map, you'll see systems. Some of them involve the loss of major ice sheets, some involve reorganizing the ocean or the atmosphere circulation, and some involve abrupt shifts in parts of the biosphere. Now, what we would all like to know is, well, we think they're all quite risky eventualities if they were to happen, but how likely are they and how impactful would they be, and which are the highest risks? This is an area where most of the work's been on the relative likelihood of these different tipping point events and a lot less on their impacts. But we've got good reason to think the impacts would be quite profound. For example, losing the Greenland ice sheet amounts to eventually to 7 meters of sea level rise. So you may be wondering, well, how do scientists get information on the likelihood of tipping points? Well, we run our best models, but we know that our models aren't perfect. So another source of information that we use is what we call expert elicitation. It's asked the experts on particular systems listed on the right here to give an assessment of the likelihood of a tipping point at different levels of global warming, which are the blue, green, and red things at the top. And the take-home message here is, from all of that expert information, we get a simple message that if we carry on the current trajectory of global warming, which is the red trajectory, it becomes more likely than not that we should expect to see some major climate tipping points. And that's important to know, because most economic assessments of climate change have taken, in my view, the wrong assumption that these are high impact, low probability events, when in fact we're busy making them high impact, high probability events. I tried to summarize that here with the Intergovernmental on Climate Change's own assessments of the likelihood of tipping points. They've been changing their assessment over time as you go from successive reports labeled there as 2001, 2007, 2013 to 2019. We basically see our collective assessment of the risk from tipping points increasing markedly, so that now it would appear that we're in the danger zone. We're at a little over 1 degree of global warming, and we might well already be risking tipping some parts of the climate system. And I tried to summarize some of the evidence for that on this simple map. The most compelling evidence is that part of the West Antarctic ice sheet is already in irreversible retreat, and it drains the equivalent of 1.3 meters of sea level rise. There's another part of East Antarctica where the physics is comparable, and it looks like that's in retreat as well, and that ultimately would give another 3 or 4 meters of sea level rise. And up in Greenland, we see the loss of the ice accelerating, and if that's the beginning of the end, that's another 7 meters of sea level rise. So I could talk about more things on the map, but it should give you a sense that these are in this complex climate system. some profound changes are underway. Are interconnected. So there are causal interactions that link together changes in different parts of a complex system. And that's what this little summary diagram is trying to convey, that we already have evidence that the loss of sea ice in the Arctic, that's making the Arctic warm about 3 times the global average rate, has contributed to the melting the Greenland ice sheet. And the meltwater from Greenland that's pouring into the North Atlantic Ocean is making a contribution to weakening the Atlantic Ocean circulation. That in turn shifts the band of rainfall around the tropics southwards, affecting monsoons in Amazonia, West Africa, India, and it leaves heat behind in the southern hemisphere, in the Southern Ocean, contributing to the warming that threatens the Antarctic ice sheet. And that's rather worrying, because that type of causal connection, where one thing makes another thing more likely, could ultimately, in the worst case, result in what we might call a cascade, where the tipping points are like a series of dominoes on their end, and tipping one of them tips the next, which tips the next, and so on. And this map here shows information, again, from expert elicitation, now over 10 years old, which looks at our best understanding then of these causal interactions. And things in red are bad news, basically. Here they're where they could propel a cascade. And in the climate system, a tipping cascade like this is bad news, obviously, but Simon will pick up the theme that in our economic and social systems we might need some tipping cascades to help us. So if you have followed me so far and you realize, okay, there's lots of these tipping points, but one then can tip another, well, at some point that just becomes a global tipping point. That cascade would be perceived, at least from anyone looking in the future back at it, as like passing a planetary or global tipping point to a different type of Earth. We called it a hothouse Earth in a study a couple of years ago. A place where none of us should want to go, and that then highlights the challenge in a way to avoid that fate, and instead find out and create what it needs to make what we call here a stabilized Earth. So that was the bad news story for me, but it's worth remembering that when we look in our social, technological systems, they're also full of tipping points, and we've seen some of those in the past. So here's just an iconic example of how personal transport transformed in the space of about a decade in the early 20th century, in the 1900s. So this is the Easter Parade, Fifth Avenue, New York City in 1900. Everyone's in a horse-drawn carriage, apart from one person in an early automobile. 13 years later, the same parade, the same street, the same day of the year, everyone's in an automobile and one person's left in a horse-drawn carriage. That, within about a decade, personal modes of transport were transformed across certainly US cities a century or so ago. And as Simon and I have been studying, we think we're on the cusp of another tipping point in personal vehicle transport, and that's from internal combustion engine powered cars and small trucks to electric vehicles. But on that point, I'm going to pass it over to Simon. Simon, I'm going to experiment with stopping sharing, and so you can start sharing.
A potential tipping point that's going to kick us into a different future. Let's see whether it's the one that we actually want to go. But as Simon is setting up, just one note, Tim, is talking about tipping points, I get a sense that the tipping points that you're talking about are an indirect effect of policies that we're having to deal with, and not somebody having an intention to engineer a certain state into a system. So it would be really interesting now to hear Simon coming in.
Precisely.
Yes, how can government be more intentional about using policy to generate the positive kind of tipping points, instead of us continually being in this firefighting triage mode of dealing with indirect and negative tipping points.
Thanks, Millie. So I'm just going to check that you're hearing me okay and you can see my slides okay.
Yes.
Thumbs up. Thanks. Excellent. Well, thanks from me for inviting us to be part of this discussion. And first thing I want to say is it's such a pleasure to follow Tim on this, because I think his work on tipping points has transformed how people understand the risks of climate change, and also inspired a lot of people to think about whether these similar tipping points could exist in economic systems. And I think they can. I think there are signs that we are already witnessing two of them. And I think this really gives us grounds for hope. And the subtitle of our paper that we wrote together was Plausible Grounds for Hope, because so often when we work on climate change, it feels we need to go so much faster that speed we need compared to the speed of progress that we have is almost implausible. But I think these things do give us grounds for hope. Now, not going to pretend that this is the answer to everything, but I do think it represents a different way of thinking. And it's very interesting that in a lot of our economic models, like the DICE model used by Nordhaus, they assume that if you pay for a unit of emissions reduction 1 year, then the next year, if you want that emissions reduction again, you have to pay for it again. And if you think about it, that's a lot like the Greek legend of Sisyphus, who has to keep pushing the boulder up the hill, and every time it gets to the top, it rolls back down again. It's an impossible job. You never finish it. And in fact, in those standard models, the more you want to reduce emissions, the harder it supposedly gets. And what we're saying is it doesn't have to be like that. What we're dealing with here, what the IPCC has talked about, is system transitions. And that's not just marginal changes to reduce emissions. We're not talking about, for example, just burning some gas instead of burning some coal. Just check, there was interference there.
Go ahead. Sorry, Simon.
That's okay. We're not just talking about marginal changes to existing systems. We're talking about complete change, a transition from one form of technologies and activities to a completely different pattern. So the changes are not just temporary, they're actually permanent. And one of the interesting possibilities that throws up is that actually change can become easier over time, not just constantly more difficult. And so we're looking for where these tipping points might be, beyond which change becomes self-reinforcing. Now, to give an example, in the UK power sector, this is a bit like Tim was saying of his climate examples. I'm going to run you through a sort of cartoon example, but this is really happening. Think about the transition in the power sector as rolling this boulder up the hill, but unlike Sisyphus's boulder, it doesn't always fall back on you. You can actually push it over the top. And well, what happened first to get us partway up the hill was global efforts in research and development that go back to at least the 1970s, if not earlier, developing solar and wind power technologies. And in the UK, we've benefited from that global effort. Second thing that's happened is subsidies for the deployment of renewables within our own system. That's grown them, as you can see from this chart, from very low levels only a decade ago to now really quite a significant share of our power generation. So that growth of renewables brought our power sector into a slightly different system state. And you can see that what's happened here, again, this is illustrative, but as the renewables grow, they take up more of a share of the market for power generation, and they reduce the share that fossil fuels can occupy. That place is shrinking, that coal and gas have to compete over. And then on top of that, we've added carbon pricing. And what we've seen is that carbon pricing actually has been what's pushed the boulder over the top of the hill. And it's not carbon pricing in isolation, it's acting on top of those other things that have brought us close to the top of the hill. Now, what we've had is two forms of carbon pricing. One, the EU emissions trading system, which is represented by the grey shaded area on this chart, and the other is the UK's carbon floor price, which is £18 a tonne of carbon levied on the power sector. And what you see is that those two carbon prices added together at a point round about 2015 actually exceeded the carbon price, the coal gas switching price, the level of carbon price at which it becomes more profitable to run a gas plant than it does to run a coal plant. Now that is a real tipping point, because what it does is it switches the places of coal and gas in the merit order. It means that gas will tend to run ahead of coal. And so in that space for fossil fuel power generation that's already been shrunk by the growth of renewables, you now have gas occupying a large part of that space instead of coal. Of course, gas was the carbon price increases the price of gas power, but not nearly as much as it does the price of coal power. So that's why those switch over. Then what we've seen is that the two effects of that: one, that coal runs for fewer hours, and two, that whenever coal does run, it makes less profit because it's being hit by the carbon price. In combination, those contributed to the passing of a second tipping point, which is coal plants moving from being profitable to being loss-making. And as I like how this analyst said it, that they flipped the economics over. And of course, when that happens, then you have utility companies deciding it's just not worth their while of running coal plants anymore. And you have nice examples of fairly irreversible change taking place in a very visible way, obviously giving enjoyment to some of these spectators. So just to illustrate that in a way, you've got that first tipping point that made gas cheaper than coal, leading on to that second tipping point where coal has gone from profit making to loss making. So it's a mini tipping cascade within the UK power system. And the result of that has been this incredibly steep decline in coal's share of power generation, from 40% 8 years ago to about 2% last year. And this year, 67 days without coal power at all. And amazingly, that's actually made the UK the fastest power sector decarbonising country in the world, at least over this period, narrowly beating Denmark. I think that's very significant because almost all of the countries listed here will have had a lot of policies that were similar to ours. A lot of them will have had renewable subsidies, probably all of them. And many of them will have had some form of carbon pricing as well. I think the reason the UK has come out top is it's the only one that's actually had the combination of policies that has led to that tipping point. Just to say that the next tipping point that we're likely to experience, we're expecting to experience, is offshore wind becoming cheaper than gas in our power sector. And a short time ago, absolutely nobody expected that. 10 years ago, we were signing contracts for £140 a tonne. Now they're down around £40 a tonne. And it's a combination of policies that's achieved that: subsidies, competitive fixed price auctions, as well as grid connections, and of course, opening up the land, the physical resources that were necessary for that. And that's interesting because the UK at the start of this process was over half the global market for offshore wind. So it shows that, in fact, you can do an awful lot, even as just one country, in pushing that boulder up the hill and down the other side. What we're looking at as in our role as incoming COP presidency is how do we accelerate this power sector transition across the world? And this for me is the most fundamental relationship at work here, the Wright's Law relationship, that for every doubling of cumulative global production, you have a constant reduction in price. And if you think about it, this is the downward slope of the hill. This is why the downward slope exists. The more you do, the easier it gets. The more we install globally, the cheaper it becomes. And so one way of looking at that is this very, very likely tipping cascade through time, that we're already now at this tipping point number one, where new renewables are becoming cheaper than new coal and gas. They already are in many places. And that will almost inevitably move towards a second one. As the deployment goes up and the costs come down, we'll move towards the second point where new renewables become cheaper than running existing coal and gas. And at that point, you can really expect this transition to accelerate. And we're so close to this already. This is why coal power plants have been closing faster under Trump than they did under Obama in the US. You can also look at it as a tipping cascade across countries, that when any country passes that point where renewable power just becomes the most economically competitive source and begins scaling up more quickly, it adds to that global cumulative deployment. It increases that cost reduction, and it helps other countries get closer to that tipping point themselves. And of course, it's complicated. In many countries, these are deeply complex challenges of regulatory reform and political economy that you have to overcome. But what we're trying to do through COP26 is bring together the political, financial, technological leaders in the sector to make sure that each country reaches that tipping point as soon as possible. I think it's helpful to recognize that, just as Tim showed us in the climate system, the different elements, potential tipping elements, are connected. That's true in the economic system as well, that you've got, of course, clean power that can accelerate the decarbonization of many sectors. You've also got hydrogen as an energy carrier that could be useful in industry, buildings, heavy transport. And you've got some of these technologies like batteries and smart energy systems that help connect the systems and contribute to the decarbonization of many of them. And one way of thinking about this is that there will be sectors where it's easier to get started and you can scale up some of these technologies and have follow-on helpful impacts on other sectors. And so Tim mentioned cars and showed that in Norway, you've got this effect of carbon pricing, in fact, a combination of tax and subsidy, adding on top of many other EV supporting policies and pushing that boulder over the top of the hill. And what we've found is the result of that has been that Norway's EV market share is about 10 times higher than any of the other countries that are moving on that transition. But when we look at that with COP26, then we're really looking at this potential for a global tipping cascade, where not only do we come together as major car market countries and accelerate that transition in road transport, but if we do, then we hugely scale up batteries, which supports the decarbonization of the power sector. And we also accelerate the shrinkage of the most important market for oil, road transport, and increase the likelihood of oil firms committing very seriously to diversifying their investments. So with the potential for those kind of cross-sectoral tipping cascades, then there is the potential for the positive version of global change. As Tim talked about, the risk of a climate tipping cascade is the whole global climate becomes unstable in a bad way. The opportunity of an economic tipping cascade is the whole global energy economy becomes unstable in a good way. And when these transitions in each sector gather pace, they eventually converge and move the whole global economy into a low carbon state, which is of course what we're aiming at. So just to finish with a couple of reflections on policy, what this means in practice. The one thing to say is, of course, carbon pricing is not the only answer. That whenever we look at real progress being made, then you can see it's also RD&D, and it's very targeted investment, often subsidy, sometimes procurement, that is pushing that boulder up near somewhere, tip it over the top of the hill, as in the UK power sector and the Norwegian road transport sector. And I think this is very different from the view that you need a single carbon price across the whole economy. If you do that, you might be lucky in one sector that it's just the right level to tip a transition, but in others, it might be much less than you need, and in others, it might be much more than you need and unnecessary. So I think it's more helpful to look at exactly what are you trying to tip in the system, and to target a carbon price so that it does that. It's the difference between allocative economic efficiency and dynamic effectiveness. The other thing I think for policy, especially if it's international facing, is rather than looking at a map curve and just selecting the policies that give you the most immediate emissions reduction per dollar spent, it may be more helpful to look at those effects on the global system and your chances of contributing to a tipping cascade through the global economy. Especially if you're looking at it from the point of view of diplomacy, not just national policy. So I think we'll end there to have time for discussion. Be really glad to hear other people's thoughts on this. Thank you.
Super. Tim, Simon, thank you very much. I'm going to go straight into, I would call him George, and George has produced a paper recently on basic social income, which in this context could be really viewed as one way to engineer a tipping point in the social system. And he and a colleague of ours who also works in the Global Policy Network in UNDP Laurel are working on a paper around tipping points. So George, maybe over to you on perspectives and reflections on what we've heard and how we can bring some of this work into UNDP.
Thanks so much, Millie. Thank you, Tim, Simon, for a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed the paper, and I think this presentation catalyzes a number of ideas and tipping points on our side. I just wanted to focus on a couple of things that we're working on or thinking about and that relate to this complex challenge. One has to do with how we go about thinking about tipping points and thinking about the critical mass, either of actors or of interventions that may bring about change. And the second thing is to think about the political economy and the distributive effects and processes behind sequences that can lead to transformative change. So let me start with the first part, and I'll ask you a couple questions at the end on this. One is that most of the things that we do at UNDP and at the UN, frankly, have to do with slow and cumulative change. And as we think about, we're addressing issues, returns to education, issues that have to do with social norms around gender violence. All of these take decades to address. There are processes of 10, 20, or 30 years. And so the playing field that is laid out before us is usually trying to find a disrupting agent or policy or set of policies that can change the trajectory of a macro trend that's already happening. I think what you've introduced in this paper and in your previous work is the idea that some issues and some aspects of development don't follow that slow and cumulative curve, but rather the shape of the function, if you will, can be molded, can be shaped by policy. I think there's two things that catch my attention as you were making the presentation. One is the idea of critical mass of players that can make a collective action difference. So you mentioned 4 players, I think, in the energy sector, 10 in the transport sector, that you don't need to work with 100 countries to make a transformative change. That maybe if you think about the collective action group that can tip an issue, we can have a subset of players. And I find that to be very interesting. In my own mind, I would think of an overlapping set of players for fossil fuel subsidies, probably the 40 countries that are engaging with that. I can think of probably 8 countries that are dealing with carbon pricing issues that affect 80% of emissions right now, and so on. So you could focus on energy, on transportation, on different kinds of technology. But I think one of the things that catches my attention is that you don't need to solve for a multiple simultaneous equation, because in policy, what we have, not everything happens simultaneously. We have sequences. So sort of the question that I pose to you is thinking about the sequence of policy and regulatory and pricing that can bring about transformative change, and how you see that sequence into the future. The second thing that I wanted to point out is that the idea of critical mass of interventions, which also comes out very clearly from your presentations. There's no silver bullets. It's not about carbon pricing, but it's carbon pricing plus technological change, plus regulatory nudges. And when you bring those together, when you bring the acupuncture of policy to bear on an issue, then you might see some leverage, and you might see some capacity to, in my own mind, to compress time. And we've been working with our colleagues on gender issues. We've known for decades that it's about power, it's about changing social norms. How do we compress time so that labor market participation rates change, so that gender violence changes? We can't just wait around for the system to figure itself out. We need the policy nudges, we need the transformative change. So I also think about this need to compress time on the climate change front. As you know, that becomes a big political economy distributive issues. We've seen the yellow vests in France. We've seen people out on the streets in Chile and Ecuador. And as we want to bring out positive change, in a sense, the technology and the pricing is running ahead of society. And so my second question to you is, how do we think about that mismatch? How do we get the social technology, if you will, the distributive side, working together on this front? In a sense, for a long time, we've been sort of learning to work within this low and cumulative change. And what you're posing to us is that we need to learn to destabilize equilibrium, to learn to jump into new equilibrium. How do we do that socially and politically? And I think that's something that UNDP has been working on silently, if you will, over the years and decades. And we have a lot of on-the-ground experience on how distributive change happens and what the obstacles are, as well as what may facilitate that over time. So I just wanted to stop there with a couple of these queries, but I'm fascinated by your work, and I think there's a lot that we can take away from this presentation and your research. Thank you so much.
Thanks, George, so much.
Thanks, George. Simon is best.
If you guys don't mind, I would suggest going straight to Pradeep, who also works for the Bureau for Program and Policy Support within UNDP and its global GPN. Pradeep, over to you, please.
All right, thanks, Millie. And indeed, thanks, Tim and Simon, for a very interesting talk. I have to say, it's really coincidental that your talk came after my nighttime reading last night. I was reading Bill McKibben's new book, Falter. And you know, when you read that book, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's listening in, you really do worry about where exactly we are and whether these tipping points are in fact shaping out to be in the direction that we needed to be. You know, Falter makes the point and reminds us about what's really at stake here. You know, he mentions this crazy statistics of the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima bombs worth of heat every second that we're facing. That's the cumulative impact. You know, many of us, most of us probably watched the U.S. presidential election debate last night, and you know, the world is just crazy. And what worries me in all of this is, you know, are we doing enough? Are we really setting ourselves up for the kind of change that's needed, given the gravity of the issues that we face? And what exactly are those nudges that we need to sort of leverage and press upon in order to get this entire sort of system heading in the direction that we would ideally want it to, and certainly need it to be for future generations, rather than where it's heading, which is, I'm afraid, into the bottom of that pit that you described in your graphic. Now, in UNDP, and George and colleagues worked recently on a paper on tipping points, and certainly we also recognize how important some of these tipping points are important, not least of which is to make the climate and nature-based transitions, and which promotes a more sustainable consumption and production pattern. But we also recognize that there are many other sort of tipping points that are critical for us to sort of move towards a recovery, particularly in today's context. That is green and hopefully lays the foundations for what's needed in the years to come. One that involves, rights-based social contracts, capabilities revolution, sort of a gender equal society, a digital disruption, and effectively a sort of a greener version of what we had in the past, Bretton Woods, which essentially would reassert a rebirth of multilateralism. And until we have that, we are facing an escalating crisis that is really even persuaded by Bill's recent book, that we're breaching all kinds of potentially rising temperatures and certainly the destruction of ecosystems and biodiversity. And the recent reports certainly suggest that we're not heading in the direction that we need to. And as much as I am an optimist, and there are lots of signs that suggest that we have reason for hope, I'm also a little bit aghast at some of the indications we're seeing today, and whether people recognize, what really is at stake. I mean, think about it. Of the $12 trillion of stimulus spending that's been allocated already by the 50 largest economies of the world, green measures account for less than 0.2%, right? 16% of the 2008 financial crisis stimulus package accounted for a lot more, right? The amount of stimulus allocated by the G20 nations to the fossil fuel industry currently amounts to about 250 billion of that stimulus, compared to about 180 billion for clean energy. So at some point, I ask myself, are we really serious? I mean, do we really recognize what's at stake here? And are we actually using the levers that we need to head to make the transitions that we need to? And I can't help but argue and feel that no, we're not doing enough. And some of these things definitely have to change. We would have passed a number of tipping points that will hopefully help us correct this. And we would be locked into kind of irreversible changes, damages to people and planet. It's not very far away. It's less than 10 years from now. And the amount that's needed to make this transition isn't all that large, comparatively speaking, but the commitments aren't there. So I feel that ultimately, indeed, it's important to ensure that we recognize the way in which change is to occur. It doesn't have to necessarily involve a complex consideration of an integrated system, that we can, through some positive, proactive, targeted interventions, start creating the snowball effect that will create the kind of change that's needed. But we need to see more of it. And the signs are there, and I think, hopefully in the lead up to the COP, what we are, I think, all hoping and is that some of these efforts will certainly snowball into the kind of change that we need to see. And those changes are there. I think the EU has pledged about 30% of its COVID recovery for climate action in a bid to cut EU emissions by about 55% by 2030. A lot of developing countries are now starting to get on the same sort of train. Nigeria abandoned its, after decades of fossil fuel subsidies, they've abandoned it now in favor of investing in health and education. Rwanda is following suit. China is investing about $27 billion on clean energy based on statistics in on the carbon tracker, compared to about $5 billion for fossil fuel subsidies. So certainly, I think there's room and there's place to be optimistic, but we urgently need, I think, to do a lot more to ensure that What is currently happening, which is a little bit unevenly distributed, gets a little bit more focused and targeted, and we help countries to overcome those kinds of barriers that need to be overcome so that they really do get past some of these positive tipping points if we are really to change course. So let me leave it there, but thanks again for a very interesting and provocative discussion.
Pradeep, thank you so much. Tim, Simon, maybe over to you guys. I'm just gonna, George put out a couple of questions to you. One regarding sequencing. So how do policymakers think about sequencing various policy instruments to generate tipping points? And when we think about disrupting the equilibrium, we see certain parts in systems like technology and financing getting ahead of maybe social change. How do we make decisions on where to exactly intervene to generate the cascade? So over to you.
Tim, do you want to go first?
I'll give it a quick go. Thank you, George and Pradeep. I completely share your sentiments. On the distributive issue, I just think it's worth noting the kind of solar power revolution that's coming right now, because if anything's going to distribute and democratize access to energy, it's the fact that solar panel power is everywhere and panels are getting cheaper. And I think that's it's going to democratize energy in a sense. It's a fundamentally distributed source of energy that we already see people in many developing nations tapping into through affordable solar panel completely off grid. I think that that's an exciting, positive part of the future, that it comes necessarily with the nature of the energy source, that it will give people back more agency over their power supply in a literal sense. They'll get, in a strange sense, they'll get political empowerment through literal power from the sun. And just on the, to the points that Pradeep was also making, as I'm not like Simon working in the cabinet office, I can probably say some things more from the perspective of a citizen. My perception is there are extraordinary bottom-up self-organized movements of people in all and many nations who are driving for change. And I think for me, part of the secret here is to have a kind of holy alliance between those bottom-up grassroots movements for change and the top-down policy nudges and incentives and decisions that we've been talking about. And if we can, it'll be different for different nations, but I think it's possible to identify those sweet spots where the top-down and the bottom-up will feed off each other to create the change we need. Now, I hinted at it a little for the energy sector. I think that becomes even clearer when one's thinking about how to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from land use and agriculture, and the link that has to, for example, dietary change and personal health from dietary change and so on. Over to Simon.
Simon, and just as you warm up to sort of do ping pong with George and Pradeep, an additional bit to throw at you is I think we have colleagues on the call who have access to high-level policymakers across different sectors. So maybe at one point in time, from your unique perspective from working at the cabinet office, how do they pitch something like this, an empowering policy instrument that can generate change and generate these tipping points to a partner in the government? How do they make it operational and real and get someone to do something around this type of work?
All right, just to make it easier. Well, look, thanks, George and Pradeep. It's excellent listening to you. To begin with George's comments, I think you put it really eloquently, that what we're looking for is a critical mass of actors and a critical mass of interventions. And you talked about sequencing. I think, so let me try and bring those two ideas together. I've been learning a lot from Frank Heels and his work on what he calls socio-technical transitions, how big changes have happened in the past, like the horses to cars example that Tim showed. And in an effort to simplify the complexity, he's broken down these transitions into 3 stages: the emergence, diffusion, and reconfiguration stages. And that gives us one framework for thinking about the sequencing of policies. And in that first, it's a lot about support to RD&D in the emergence phase and the creation of a niche where the new practices or technologies can establish themselves first. And until you have that niche, almost nothing else is going to happen. So, you know, for solar, the first niche was a solar panel on a satellite. For steel, I don't know what it's going to be. We still haven't really seen it yet. And so that's why that transition is not going anywhere yet. Once you've established that niche, you test out different technologies, you stabilize expectations eventually around where things are going to head, and then you can get into the diffusion phase. And once you're there, your policies are really much more about deployment, and they might include subsidy, they might include carbon pricing, or they might include regulations, but it's all the stuff we're familiar with. Then when you get to reconfiguration, then it's more about ensuring the change spreads throughout the entire system. So if we think about the power sector, deploying a load of solar and wind is great for the diffusion phase, but when we fossil fuels even for peaking, so what do we do with interseasonal energy storage and that kind of thing? When you look at that in terms of the actors you need, one thing I think is quite interesting is that early on in the transition, you need a very small number of actors to get it going. So to create that first niche, I really think there's a great coordination gain from international cooperation, because if we as the UK government create a very small niche for zero carbon steel, that might not be enough for any of the multinational companies to bother investing in it. It might not be worth their while. Whereas if we agree with China and India and Europe that we're going to align and all create the same kind of niche at the same kind of time, it's much more likely that investment will take place. But I think we only need a handful of actors to do that. When you get into diffusion phase, you need a medium-sized number. Like you say in the car market, 10 countries get you 3/4 of global car sales. They could definitely shift that market. You don't need 196. When you get towards reconfiguration, it's possible that you need a larger number to make sure that that change really is pervasive throughout the whole global economy. So I think you start with smaller groups and you grow those groups as you go along. That, relating that to your other point, I think about how do we make sure the social change goes along with the technological change. I'd say ideally what we're trying to create is the reinforcing feedback between the government, business and society. And I talked a little bit about offshore wind in the UK. I think it's a good example of that, where the policy has led to investment, which has created jobs. And there are now people in those regions where the jobs are being created who are lobbying for stronger policy. That's exactly the kind of reinforcing feedback we want to see. I think the climate change community has sometimes made the mistake in the past, especially internationally, of convening groups of the same actor and organizing the problems around the actor. So let's get all the city mayors together, or all the young people, or all the finance ministers. And to me, that's a bit like saying, well, let's have a meeting of all the goalkeepers. Well, they can all exchange best practice in goalkeeping, but they're not going to win you a football game. So if you want to win the game, you have to organize the actors around the problem, not organize the problems around the actor. And a good example of that, I think, is Germany's Coal Commission, where they said, look, we've got a problem with coal, guys. What are we going to do about this? And they got together the climate scientists, the coal industry people, the regional government, the trade unions, the local communities, and all of them sat down together and said, how do we solve this coal problem? I think that's a good example, and we need to do that on local, national, and global levels. So to respond to Pradeep, I couldn't agree more. We are not doing enough, and you use the word focused, which I like, and I think is critical. we need focused cooperation on each parts of the climate change problem in each sector. We need to be looking at how do we change the guts and the plumbing of the global economic system, more structures for doing that. I have to be careful how I say this, but what is in my mind every time I think about it seriously is we're barely even trying. We've been talking about climate change for 40 years, and yet we still don't have established structures for focused cooperation in each of the main sectors where greenhouse gases come from. We bring together the right actors to have the right conversations. So I think there's a desperate need for us to do more in that way. We hope to use COP26 to play a catalytic role, but we're very aware that we are just one actor within this big landscape. So we need all the help that we can get. And thank you for this chance to talk to you.
Look, you're not alone. You have countless supporters and partners in crime, and certainly count on us in UNDP to sort of galvanize around you and other countries. I mean, you know, the reality is, and I'm realizing this after speaking to a colleague last night in Beijing, China is just coming out of the lockdown, and according to him, pollution is off the sky. Things are, you know, as bad as they were before, a little bit better, relatively speaking. And it made me think, I mean, this entire world came to a standstill with COVID, and we've learned nothing from it. Nothing, absolutely nothing, right? And we are going towards a year where, unless things fundamentally shift, and you're right, Tim, I think it is a grassroots level conversation that needs to sort of be spearheaded. And I think part of the focus has to be to tackle the elephant in the room, which is vested political interests. How do we deal with these things? Because unless we get to the heart of that matter, whether it is, you know, the GM workers who are protesting against introduction of electric vehicles, or politicians who are not doing enough on the subsidy reform that has to take place, or company shareholders who are hanging on to whatever they is making them, you know, wealthier at the expense of everybody else, we are suffering from it. So I think we do need to have some focused efforts to tackle the political economy construct in all of this. Otherwise, I feel we'll be tinkering on the margins and not really making the kind of transformative changes we need.
Thank you guys so much. And Pradeep flagged to me bilaterally that it is all guys in a sense in this panel. So I think we need to do a little better next time to make sure that we have, and we do have a really good set of female policymakers and researchers that we can bring to this discussion more. For this time, Tim and Simon, thank you guys so much. It has been very illuminating. A lot of the colleagues sort of ping me bilaterally to say, and it's interesting that this feedback comes in. It's empowering to hear about a possibility that somebody is in the driving seat when it comes to dealing with complex issues. And I think this is exactly the point that we wanted to put across. Thanks to George and Pradeep, GPN's own, who are doing quite a bit of work in this field. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We have not gotten to all the questions. I will make sure to share them with Tim and Simon subsequently. If there are interests in the countries that you're working in, to put some of this into practice, let us know. We will see what we can do in terms of generating possibilities to collaborate with Tim and Simon and their teams to make this happen, and obviously with Pradeep and George moving forward. So with this, thanks everybody. We will circulate the slides and the recording, and looking forward to continuing the collaboration. Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Millie and everyone.
Thank you.